Okay, great. Thank you. And now to our speaker, Bailin Shaw. And Bailin is one of a long line of scientists that that we've had at the MAS membership meetings. He is an immunologist, and he works in cancer research for a high-tech firm in Chicago. And his project, as I read it, is developing small molecules that target cancer cells. So this could be somebody who is very important to our futures. But on the other side, so in addition to his day job, can you guys hear me?
We can now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to Bailin's day job, he goes around proselytizing plants, and when I asked him, he said he was the founder and president of the Chicago Aquatic Plant Society, but that in his travels, he basically tries to establish a local aquatic plant society in every city he stops at. So this is a true believer, but I think more importantly, he serves on the board of directors of the Aquatic Gardener Association. So this is an international club for aquascaping. They have an annual international meeting, and he has been essentially he calls himself the contest chair. But what that really means is that he's the head judge. Now, we have gone a full 30 minutes, so I'm not going to talk anymore about Bailin. Bailin, I'm going to let you start, okay?
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate the introductions. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you guys see that, or am I?
Yes, you're in the edit mode.
Did I share the wrong screen again?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on.
I think you shared the right screen. You just need to hit F5 and start presentation.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you, Willie, again for the introduction and the invite to speak with you guys. And Willie is correct. Every place that I've been, I've started up a little planted aquarium society of some sort, and partly because I'd like to find people who are of like mind and who also can appreciate aquatic plants. I started out as your normal fish aquarist, and I love fish. I'm a huge nanofish enthusiast, but I'm also using my scientific background. I also really enjoy the plant aspect of it and being able to maintain a planted aquarium for the benefit of the fish. And so I've kind of blending both sides of the aquarium hobby. So today, this talk is going to be a very basic talk on some of the very basic principles of aquascaping. So we're kind of incorporating some different ideas of art and how you can use art to create an aquascape. And then talking about different types of features and not so much rules, but ideas that you can utilize to actually create an aesthetically pleasing aquascape. Now, the aquascape that you guys see here, let me see. So the aquascape that you see here is a scape that was designed by a young man that's in our club. At the time, he was 28 years old, and he was competing in the Aquatic Experience Aquascaping Contest. This aquascape was basically that year's showstopper. It's a small nanocube, probably about 8 gallons total size. But he utilized a lot of different types of techniques as well as materials to create an aquascape that looked it just incredible in terms of depth, in terms of contrast, in terms of color, not so much the color, but in terms of the different features that when you look at it, it just drew your eyes to it. And it was really striking helping run this contest and seeing him compete and seeing people take a walk through looking at the different aquascapes and basically stopping stopping in front of his aquascape and just standing there and staring at it. It was an absolutely beautiful aquascape, and he was it was a well-deserved. He won the contest that year, and as well as the People's Choice, and it was a very well-deserved award. And he's still competing. He still has some absolutely gorgeous aquascapes, and so be sure to keep his name in your radar. John Penny is he's still another still active in our club. So, how do you describe aquascaping? How is it defined? What I like to think of it is it's kind of described as underwater gardening. It utilizes a lot of the same scientific principles that you would use when you're gardening in outdoors for vegetable gardens or your flower gardens. But in this case, you're utilizing hardscape material like rocks and wood and other types of materials, sand and aquatic plants to build that particular layout. Aquascaping, like normal gardening, incorporates aquatic horticulture. You have to understand your basic gardening principles, what kind of nutrients are needed, what plants, how they grow, what plants grow well, and the conditions that you have. It also requires real good husbandry, and you need to understand pruning techniques. Just like your gardens outside, like for instance, your tomato plants. I know with me, I go in, I clip them off, and I clip off the suckers. It's kind of the same concept when you're doing an aquatic aquascape. You look for the plants when they get a certain size, you clip them and you prune them so that they maintain their shape and their color. It's also utilizing a lot of the design and layout principles that you take from art. And this is something we'll definitely go over in much greater detail. But the biggest thing is just being able to incorporate imagination and innovation. And what I mean by that is if you look at this aquascape, this could be a scene from someplace out in nature, right? A mountainside or something like that. And you see this, and then you take that image and you recreate that inside an aquarium. And so it's taken all these different principles and putting them into an aquascape. So there are what I consider 4 basic tenets or 4 basic rules used in aquascape. Aquascaping, you have use of focal points, and we'll go through each of these in much better detail. So you get and we'll have images for you guys to kind of see how this works. A lot of aquascapers really emphasize the focal points, and you'll see why, because it leads your eyes across your aquascape, and it gives you different ideas and images of what you're trying to emphasize. We also use what we call the rule of thirds and the golden rule, and this is a very common idea that's used, or a rule, basically a principle that's used in art. They use contrast, including color, including texture, light and dark. These are all things that you can incorporate into the aquascape. And then scale. And this last one's pretty important. Depending on the size of your tank, you want to keep everything in scale. So we'll start out by using, and then also we'll talk about some other principles of aquascaping. A lot of times, for instance, I have this bad habit of doing collectoritis. I like a certain plant, I'll get it in my aquariums and I'll start growing it, but it's maybe one of maybe 13 or 14, sometimes up to 20 different type of plants that I'm trying to grow at one time. And so there's not a cohesive structure or a cohesive an idea of what you're trying to portray in the aquascape. So you try to keep it simple, utilizing just a few basic plants, and then expanding that palette so that you can really exemplify and show what the aquascape's doing. Incorporate variety, but at the same time, keep it simple. Don't add different colors, add different textures, but don't overdo it so that there are just too many things for your eyes to follow. And then you want to choose plants and hardscape that are always in proportion to the size of your tanks. Now, the tank is something that I am very big on emphasizing. This tank that was created by one of our scapers in the club, Marvin Lowe, this was the same size tank that that was used by the first image that I showed you, the first aquascape. He used large pieces of rock to create the scale that you're looking at the side of a mountain. But the tank, because of its height, it was a little different in terms of its size. It was taller than it actually was than wide in terms of length. So you wanted to kind of fill that space, and what he was able to do was utilize large pieces of rock with small ones built in and incorporated in to build this larger structure that makes it seem like the aquascape was much larger than the actual size it was. And then on top of that, you want to get everything right. It's unlikely you're going to get everything right the first time. I've been doing this for well over 20 years. And even now, after I set up a tank, there's a lot of times that I tear it right back down, partly because there's something about it that I don't like, or there's some aspect of the aquascape that I put together that I know doesn't fit in the tank. And so it's not unusual to create something, let it run for a bit, and then realize that you want to try something different. So don't get discouraged. That's just part of the fun of aquascaping. So how is aquascaping defined, and what are the focal points? Focal points basically function as a way for your eyes to follow the aquascape. It anchors your eyes in the aquascape, and then it directs your eyes in a natural flow of the aquascape. This is a aquascape produced by Thiago Eloy, I think it's his last name. He's a Brazilian aquascaper, and the Brazilian aquascapers have a very distinctive style. This particular style is been kind of perfected by this group of aquascapers that I know quite well down there, and they utilize large rocks and a lot of color, a lot of plants, but they use these hardscape and the plants to do directional flow. So a lot of times what you'll see is that for instance, in this case, your eyes will immediately go to your first focal point, and then it moves toward the direction as from the left to right. This large stone, when I look at this is where my eyes naturally drifts to, and this is the first focal point. The second, what I would consider a second primary focal point, is from the left to right again, and this is done by using plants with color and having it flow from one direction from the top down into the top, the left third of the tank. And then you have another focal point where your eyes naturally go from one to the focal point of one, it naturally will kind of move to number two and move toward the second focal point, around this piece of hardscape. And then the use of color, this is the one that I found really interesting. It was a use of color and a different texture type of plant. That's what I would consider the last focal point. It's the least dominant of the focal points, but it's still, if you looked at this aquascape, there's this natural directional flow going from left to right, going from the largest focal point, the one that draws your eyes, to a secondary focal point, and then going to the color splash of the plants. So it basically is a great way for you to lead your eyes from one direction to another throughout the aquascape. In small aquascapes, generally you usually only have one, and I'll kind of show some examples of that. But larger aquascape, this tank was I think it was a little over 120 gallons. It requires a lot more thought and depth and use of these types of different focal points to really make the eye move across a tank. And so you basically, by choosing different plants, different colors, different types of hardscape, you can really create this directional flow with the focal points. Now, the aquascapers also utilize what they call the golden ratio aquascaping. The golden ratio is a concept that's used in art. It dates back to centuries before, where the Greeks originally came up with the idea, where the thought was that if you look and you develop a ratio in a space where the ratio is 1 to 1.618, How they came up with that number, who knows? But it's thought that this ratio 1 to 1.618 is the most pleasing to the eye, and this is a great area for where you can usually identify the first focal point. In an aquarium that is of different sizes, say like you have a this is a 30-inch aquarium, right? And this is a trying to remember what 30 inches and maybe a 20-gallon long, I think. Or is that? Maybe that's too short. It's still too long, too short. But regardless, if you had a 30-inch tank, in this case, you would take the total length, the addition of the total value of the ratios, divide that value by 2.618, and that would be where the lines intersect in your rule of thirds or your golden ratio. And so this first smaller portion in this case would be the 11.45 inches, and that's, you would put your lines right across here to be what you would identify as your first focal point. And this is something, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's something that you can do if you're trying to create an image right away and create something where you have a nice piece of wood or a nice piece of rock and you want it to have the best emphasis. Now, we also use what they call rule of thirds. This is a very classical, what they call an Iwagumi aquascape. This particular type of aquascape relies only on hardscape, usually rocks and wood, and then maybe usually one, but maybe two types of plants. It looks very, very simple, but the rules that govern how to create the Iwagumi are very, very specific. It's also a very challenging aquascape to maintain. Usually the types of plants that you use are fairly challenging. They're sometimes hard to maintain. It's not usually one I recommend for people to start out with. There are a lot of other types of aquascapes that I can show you guys that will make they're much prettier, easier to maintain. But regardless, if you have an aquarium, say you have a 75-gallon tank, what a lot of people do in the aquascaping community is they draw lines across their tanks, and usually just like with wax pencils or something like that, and they split the tank up into 3 portions horizontally as well as vertically. And then where the lines intersect are usually places where you would add your main focal point or your secondary focal point. And the elements they basically, by utilizing the hardscapes and grouping these guys together, you can create a pretty a very natural looking aquascape or a natural looking image of what you're trying to reproduce. And so a lot of people utilize this. A lot of aquascapers utilize this, and a lot of times you'll see them actually before they start aquascaping will draw the lines. I do this in a lot of my aquascapes as well, and this can be applied to basically any shape of a tank. You can do it with a 75 with a cube tank. This really helps in terms of being able to focus and identify areas that you can really emphasize where to place hardscape so that it has the best visual. It looks the best. Now, here's an application of the rule of thirds. This is something that I've kind of done in the past. This is not my tank, but I've done something like this in the past where I've made this mistake. And it's not really a mistake, but you can see where the impact of this makes a much bigger difference if you place your hardscape in the right areas in the right positions. So a lot of times, when I first did one of my first aquascapes, I placed hardscape right in the middle of the tank. And what that does is it creates almost like a mirror image so that the eyes doesn't really have a direction where it wants to go. What you end up doing is it makes it very difficult to create a specific shape. And it's difficult for your eyes to really find an area to focus on in the aquascape. One of the other things that you really want to do when you do this, when you create an aquascape, is you want to incorporate a horizon or what they call empty space. And there are 2 things that this does. This first thing is it draws your eyes from one direction to another. The second thing that it also does is that it allows for the livestock, the fish that you have in there, to really utilize that space, and it showcases what you're keeping in your tank. And so I've started doing this for quite a few years. I've done the mistake of putting the hardscape in the middle, and it makes the aquascape crowded, even though it doesn't seem like it should be. It makes the scape look crowded because you have a lot of times you end up planting on either side of here of the main focal point, and it really kind of takes away from the flow and directionality of the aquascape. Now, this is kind of a contradiction to what I'm talking about in terms of the proper scale is critical, right? And so this was a nano tank that was in the AGA's aquascaping contest. This tank was, I believe, was only about 6 gallons. Yet this individual, Harry Razio, he utilized this just gorgeous piece of driftwood and was able to fill the space out, but he still was able to kind of show an area of emphasis and directionality in terms of flow. But what he did really, really well in this case, even though it filled out the tank, he utilized plants that were very, very small and very adapted to this particular type of scape. So the goal a lot of times with an aquascape is to make it look much larger than it actually is. So some of the aquascapes that we'll take a look at, you get the impression that this aquascape that this guy's created is in this huge tank, but in reality, it's a much smaller space, usually a nano tank or something that's more of a standard size aquarium. But he used these, not only the focal points, but used the types of plants to create a lot of just a aquascape really showcase this particular piece of wood. So substrate, hardscape, and your gravel size, it also makes a really big impact on your aquascape. If you have a small aquascape, don't use large, or avoid using very large gravels. It actually makes it'll make your aquascape look much smaller than it actually is. Hardscape is the same thing. Look for hardscape that has a lot of texture, a lot of contrast to it, and that'll help you create a much smaller, a much larger aquascape in a much smaller space. Also, definitely keep in mind that your plants, they're going to look different from the minute that you put them into the aquarium. A lot of the aquatic plants that you get from online retailers, a lot of the local fish stores, most of those come from Florida Aquatic Nursery or a few select aquarium plant horticulture companies. A lot of these are grown outdoors, so they have a much different texture and appearance when you put them into the aquascape. A lot of times these plants will grow very differently in terms of color, in terms of size, and a lot of times they can overtake a tank very quickly. So, for instance, in this tank, if you had used the sword plant, it was a small nano tank. The sword plant would soon basically outgrow this tank. So think of in terms of what the mature plant would look like and whether you can use that in a smaller tank or a larger tank. Now, I mentioned contrast in terms of aquascaping, how to utilize contrast in looks in terms of creating a lot of visual interest, a lot of depth, and in turn, a lot of what we call in the aquascaping, we like to call tension. And you utilize different light and dark. And for instance, in this case, he utilized a very large piece of a stone that really had beautiful contrast, a lot of color, a lot of texture in it. But he moved the rock so that this particular shape and direction of it had shadows. So you're using light in terms of the top of the plants at the top, where you have a lot of color and a lot of light, that really helps to create this different, this type of contrast and this tension that you're talking about and visual interest. And then also just the different textures. And you see this one, the Hygrophila pentatifida, It has this beautiful serrated edge and beautiful color. The undersides are green, the tops are red. And as it's flowing in the aquarium, the flow of the filters are moving around, you'll see this color shift back and forth when the leaves move in the flow. And he also uses different textures and different types of colors with his stem plants. And then different mosses at the bottom to kind of soften the edges of your hardscape. The other thing is utilizing different hardscape that will differ in coloration from the texture of the color and texture of your hardscape and the substrate. So in this case, he used a little bit of substrate, a sand that was very light in color, but it contrasts very nicely with the dark coloration of their hardscape. So, and then on top, and finally, since we all love our fish, you want to find fish that really complement your aquascape. Don't avoid something that's too large for the aquascape. If this is a smaller tank, look for very small fish for your tanks, and keep your larger fish or tanks that are much larger in size. So like your angelfish or your discus, find a size tank that's appropriate for that and aquascape that with the thought in mind of having those particular fish in that size tank. Now, these are some of the other essential elements that I tend to think about in terms of my when I create an aquascape. Pick the appropriately sized aquarium. That's very, very important. Avoid your tall tanks or very, very shallow tanks. You'll find that with tall tanks, the light that you have is not going to be sufficient to really hit the bottom of the tank. So again, you see this is the same tank that was used at by the same aquascaper in the very beginning of the title page. In this case, he used a large aquarium. I mean, a lot of different smaller plants, but his light was plenty bright enough that it can hit the bottom of the substrate so that these more high demanding plants could actually grow extremely well. And so he was able to use these different textures and different hardscape material to create a pretty attractive looking aquascape. And a lot of different textures and a lot of beautiful, healthy plants. So you want to look for lights then that are able to give you that penetration down to the bottom of the aquarium. And in this case, look for something that has a good mix of the red, green, and blues. In particular, the reds are something that I find that a lot of aquarium lights they don't emphasize, but the red is important in terms of the photosynthetic needs for a plant. You also want to look at the PAR values. The PAR basically is a measure of how much light you have. And if the higher the PAR value, the better it is and easier it is to get down to the substrate of your tank. And then that way your plants, they have plenty of light to grow with. I tend to overfilter my aquascapes. Generally 10 times is what I recommend, but I can easily go well over that. Good movement ensures that you don't have stagnant areas where you can get detritus buildup, you can get nutrient buildup. Each of those will contribute to issues with algae. So the good husbandry, good flow, a good light, good filtration, these are all real kind of critical aspects of the aquascape that you want to maintain. Substrate, so I can talk about this in depth. This is one of my big talking points that I like to emphasize. A good quality aquarium plant substrate is something that is more of a clay-based. And then something, if you guys have questions, I have an additional slide later that kind of goes through that in detail. But it's more, a lot of these aqua soils that are on the market now are awesome substrates for your planted tanks. Stuff like gravel you can use, but there's a maturation process that's really, that a lot of people overlook for plants. Just like your gardens, it requires a certain amount of bacteria to get into your substrate or into your gravel for it to really start utilizing the nutrients that your plants need. And so these substrates, these aqua soils already have a lot of the nutrients and the necessary ingredients that these bacteria can easily go in and populate and start doing the nutrient exchange for your plants. I also emphasize carbon dioxide. It's one of my big talking points that I always try to get people to do. Just like your plants in terrestrial plants, they require a lot of carbon dioxide. Aquatic plants also need carbon dioxide. You can do tanks without them, but your plants will not be as healthy. And you just want to be sure that if you don't utilize carbon dioxide, that you find a type of plant, or you utilize types of plants that don't require that are easier to maintain. And then utilizing it as like in any garden or any plant that you have, you need to feed them. There's a lot of different ones on the market. Seachem, Tropica, all of these are all suppliers. They all sell different types of nutrients. You can even make your own. Our club likes to really recommend the Nyloc G. The Nyloc G, this particular company makes an all-in-one fertilizer. It's super simple. There are different levels for what you want to do. If you have a low-tech tank, they have one specifically designed for shrimp that's lower in nutrients. 1 pump per 10 gallons, and you're good to go. Maybe 2 to 3 times a week, look at the plants to see how they're growing and whether they're happy. If they need more, pump a little bit more. It's super easy, and it's a low maintenance type of nutrient that I like to use in some of my tanks. And then the hardscape material, you want to be careful of the different types of hardscape material you choose. You have different types of, there's a lot of stuff to choose from nowadays. The one that I like to use, a Suryu stone, is a Japanese variety or a Asian variety of stone, but it has a carbonate base so that when you put it in the tank, it does raise your carbonate hardness. So you want to be careful of that, and that's where where doing water changes once a week really helps to reset those conditions for your tank. So I tend to, in some of my tanks where I have very sensitive fish, I tend to avoid that and use different other types of stone, other types of rock and wood. And so just be careful when you're choosing it, that it doesn't change your water parameters, your water chemistry too much. Now, the different types of aquascaping styles, and I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly, but these are different styles that are utilized pretty much by anyone who's in the aquascaping community. You'll see these online and in different places all over the place. There's a large different types. These are what these are the aquascapes that I generally look at, and the different styles. There's a nature aquarium that's been popularized by Takashi Amano, and it's probably the most popular style out there in the internet and in the industry, in the hobby right now. These are all 3 different types of styles that are the nature aquarium style, and we'll kind of go through each of these in detail a little bit. Excuse me, guys. There's also the Dutch aquascapes, and we'll kind of go through each of these as well. And then what I like to call a jungle or American Eclectic is something that I kind of started out doing as well years and years ago. We all know about biotopes. Most of us have created a biotope at one point or another. And then there's paludariums, where you combine a external or a terrestrial portion with a water portion. Now, the shapes are something that I like to really kind of emphasize for someone who's really just getting into aquascapes. These are 3 basic styles that I utilize in a lot of my aquascapes. There's a convex, where you have you emphasize a larger portion in the 1/3 of the tank, and then it goes to a smaller portion in the other side of the tank. So the emphasis is on the left side in this case, flowing toward the right. There's a concave where, again, you have a greater emphasis on one side than the other. This creates that contrast, that tension that you're looking for. And then they're triangular, which is kind of like the concave, except everything's kind of pushed to one side. This is one of my favorite styles because it's easy to maintain. It's easy to set up. and it allows for a lot of empty space for your fish. Okay, so like I mentioned before, nature aquarium style was a style that was introduced by Takashi Amano around the 1990s. He was started out as a photographer, and he had this, his biography basically talked about how he had this love for nature and he wanted to recreate these scenes in nature. And so what he did was basically take a style, take elements of traditional Japanese gardening, and then he used those different aspects and created using hardscape material and different types of plants to imitate what he sees in nature. This could be easily assigned as a little island that he finds in a stream someplace. So he took a lot of photos, traveled all over the place. He was a professional biker at one point, and during his competitions, he would go and take shots of nature and then go back and recreate these images. And so there are a lot of different types of nature aquarium aquascapes, and you have the standard, your standard nature aquarium. These are what I consider like dioramas that they're fantastical. These are great for competition, but to maintain one of these types of aquascape and to create it is quite challenging. A lot of these are created very shortly, like for instance, for the aquascaping contest for the Aquatic Gardeners Association. A lot of times you'll see these and they'll be put together in a year's time and then torn down and they create something else shortly after that. And so these all kind of incorporate some of the nature aquarium style that Takashi Amano really popularized. There are also other types of nature aquarium styles. Again, I mentioned that the Iwagumi, this is what I mentioned, utilizing just a couple, one type of hardscape, some very specific focal points and a couple plants. Very difficult type of aquascape to maintain if you're not really up to your husbandry, you're not keeping your tanks clean, keeping on top of the algae. I have not successfully done this very well. It's not my favorite style, and these are in doing the research on this, there are very specific rules associated with placement of this stone, what this stone is called. It's a little too stuffy for me. Then we also have what they call dioramas, where they create like a image, or in this case, something like from The Hobbit, where they use aquarium plants to create this fantastical aquascape. And then, like I mentioned previously, the Brazilian aquascapers, they've really kind of upped their game in terms of utilizing nature aquarium style to create these sweeping mountain sides and mountain views with different kind of focal points and just stunning aquascapes. And these look absolutely huge tanks, but they're actually sometimes really quite small, or they can look much bigger than they actually are. Now, the Dutch aquascape was something that was popularized back in the 1930s, and this is something that still occurs in the Netherlands. It's implemented by the Dutch Society of Aquarists, the NBAT. They have a contest each year. We have our speaker that's going to be coming in pretty soon, and he's going to be talking about this. He's one of the Dutch aquascapers. But the main focus is on growth and placement of the plants. You're basically not looking to recreate images in nature. It's more a type of aquascape that emphasizes how well the plants are grown. There are very, very, very specific rules of number of types of plants, number of colored plants. Like for instance, in this case, they only utilize 2, and they use what they call terracing, where they create plants. They plant something in the front, and they bring it and goes up into the back of the aquascape, into the back of the tank, and it makes it feel like there's a street or a lane of plants. It's a very challenging aquascape to do. relies on very like different contrasts and colors to create focal points. And it requires that you have a very, very deep understanding and knowledge of how these plants grow, how to prune them, when they're gonna look at their best. We have, and I've never tried to attempt one of these, but I've had friends of mine do this, and it's I will tell you that this is a very, very challenging type of aquascape to do, but it's a beautiful type of aquascape if you can do it. And then there's the one that I started out doing when I first got into aquascaping, was just your you put plants in, you try to emphasize some types of colors and types of shapes, and you want to see what you can grow. It's wild, untamed. In some ways, it does mimic nature in what we see in our streams and our rivers, and in ponds. It still requires that you understand good husbandry and you understand how to cultivate these plants and how to prune them. And it's a great way for people to collect a lot of different types of aquatic plants. And a lot of there's been a lot of reference to this as the American Eclectic style, and it's something that we see a lot of in the States. It's something that I still do with a couple of my. It's a great way to maintain different species that I don't want to lose. And then there's your biotopes. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the biotopes. It's meant to create a specific natural scene, natural habitat. You can be as specific as you want, or you can be just adding some rocks and wood and trying to get something that looks similar to what you've seen in nature. Compatibility, a lot of times the exact conditions and to recreate it can be difficult because you don't necessarily want to take stuff from nature. But trying to get it to mimic what you see in terms of plants and fish can sometimes be hard to do. And so some of these, in our contest, we see a lot of South American blackwater streams. Some of these are gorgeous, and some people have really created some beautiful streams, beautiful aquascapes. You have your Asian blackwater swamps, and a lot of times I've seen some people create some, or your licorice gouramis, or those different types of barbs. And then we had last year we had someone who created it was a aquascape that was out. It mimicked the watershed in Maryland. I'm forgetting the name of it now, but it was absolutely beautifully well done. And then you have your Rift Lakes biotopes, a lot of stone and very colorful African cichlids. And then finally the paludoriums. This is created by someone, a person that I knew many years ago. Basically creates a water portion as well as a land portion, and utilized both terrestrial plants like your tropical plants, as well as aquarium plants that he grew well into the main part of the aquascape. And then several years ago, we had someone who created this just stunning aquascape using a lot of different types of stone that he glued piece by piece and formed this just gorgeous aquascape. And it's supposed to simulate some kind of biome or location that you've seen in nature. And finally, it just kind of as an end, be sure to remember that it doesn't have to go hard and fast by the rules. It doesn't need to be to follow all these different guidelines. These are just ways for you to keep the things that you can keep in mind if you're wanting to create something a little different from in terms of an aquascape that you've seen online, and it gives you the general ideas of how to utilize some of these different ideas and principles to create your own aquascape. So just keep in mind, keep aquascaping, keep doing it, and use your imagination, build your aquascape, and then just remember it doesn't happen always the first time. And in this case, so I like to end usually on this talk with the aquascape at Takashi Amano's home. This thing was a huge aquascape, and these the tank was, I think he said it measured 4 feet by 1.5 meters, 4 meters by 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, and it was basically built in his home. as his home was being built. The wood that you see here all came from the Amazon, was brought in from his, it was brought in from the Amazon, and then it was dropped in through the roof of the house as it was being built using a crane, and basically dropped in. And then he had a whole team of people basically scape this entire aquascape for him. The fish, the ultims that he had in here at the time were, I think he mentioned they were only about the size of a 50-cent piece. And by the time that he passed away, these things were well over 12 inches, 14 inches, just in the body itself. They were humongous fish. Absolutely gorgeous. So it's stunning work, and something that we can all eventually, hopefully, aspire to, although I don't think I'm rich enough to do that. Okay, so with that, I'm if you guys have any questions or any comments, I'm happy to take them at this time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Bailin. This is great. You know, I had read about all these different styles and never was able to sort of bring them all together. And this is the first time I realized, oh, that's how the Dutch style compares to, for example, Yamada. Okay.